It's my pleasure to introduce three papers in the session who won the exemplary. Does it work? Okay, now? Okay. So it's my pleasure to introduce three winners of the Exemplary Track Award in three different tracks. The first paper is the Exemplary Applied Modeling Track Award winner. It's by Manish, Raghavan, John Kleinberg, and Sendhil Mullainathan. The challenge of understanding what users want in consistent preferences and engagement optimization. Please.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? That seems on. Okay. Yeah, thanks for all being here. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about, as the title says, inconsistent preferences and computation. This is joint with John, who is here, and Sendhil, who is not. And the clicker does not seem to be doing anything.
Just engage. Yeah, sorry.
How's that? Okay, there we go. Okay, yeah, so the genesis of this paper, and when we started thinking about this a few years ago, came from the idea that something seems broken on social media. You see all these articles about how deleting your social media accounts might make you happier, how there's tons of misinformation online, how perhaps we're addicted to social media. There's all these harmful effects that we've been talking about. And there's a lot of potential explanations that people have proposed over the years. For example, you might think that it's because there are just nefarious actors online who are trying to make your life bad. Perhaps it's because platforms are greedy and are pursuing their own profits over people's well-being. Perhaps these are consequences of offline antisocial behaviors that are just manifesting offline or online. And perhaps social media is just inherently addictive and should be thought of more akin to cigarettes in the tobacco industry. I'm going to talk today a bit about what I think is a slightly different set of explanations for these problems. And this builds on a long line of work, especially in recent years, but these are problems that stem from the behavioral foundations on which these companies and their algorithms are based. And to give you a sense of, I want to give you a sense of what these behavioral foundations are, and I think this is perhaps best told through a story of me at a party with a bowl of chips right in front of me. And as I do, if there's a bowl of chips right in front of me, I start eating them one by one, and chip after chip. I don't really know how to stop myself, and eventually I finish the entire bowl. So clearly I have a bit of a self-control problem here. And on its own, that's bad enough. But to make matters worse, the host of the party then just comes up next to me and sees, oh, this bowl of chips is empty. You must have really liked them. I'm going to refill this bowl. And so they do. They refill the bowl of chips, and now I'm back to square one, where I'm sitting on the couch, bowl of chips in front of me, and I finish them. And this process is going to repeat itself until I end up feeling like I ate way too much. At the end of the day, I'm unhappy. But this is strange because no one made me do anything I didn't want to do. No one forced me to eat the chips, and yet my behavior made me unhappy. And so as I said, there's at least two problems here. Problem number one is I have poor self-control. That's on me. But there's at least another problem here, which is the host behavior. The host looked at my behavior, and they inferred my preferences from that. But of course, my preferences were inconsistent. In the moment, I wanted to be eating chips, but after the fact, I wish I hadn't. And so this is a revealed preference assumption that the host is making, right, implicitly. They're assuming they can infer what I want from what I do. And this is the basis of what many online platforms do. For instance, Netflix will look at the digital trace of the shows and movies that I've watched and use that to infer what types of shows and movies I want to watch in the future. Now you might look at my example and say, okay, well the solution is clearly to just ignore my behavior. My behavior doesn't reflect my values, and so why are we using it at all? But if I told you that story with a bowl of salad instead, you might have felt differently. Let's say there's a bowl of salad, everyone at the party is eating out of the salad bowl, and we all finish it off. The host comes back and says, salad bowl's empty, I'm going to go refill it. We might feel more okay with that. And that's possibly because intuitively we think that people have less of a self-control problem when it comes to salad relative to chips. And so this revealed preference assumption exists for a reason. It doesn't come out of nowhere. Right? It does seem to work in practice. My Netflix recommendations are pretty good. But it doesn't always. And so the goal of what we're going to do today is try to understand what the difference is between salad and chips in some sense, or try to understand the conditions under which the revealed preference assumption is a good one, where I can infer what I want from what I do, and then think about how we might design online platforms accordingly, with this understanding that my behavior might be inconsistent with my preferences. And to do this, we're going to draw on some models that are common in the behavioral economics and psychology literatures, these sort of multiple self models or two self models. You can think of things like time inconsistency and discounting as falling within this framework. But the general framework that you see here is one of two decision-making processes within me. One of these selves, which I'll call system one, is impulsive and myopic. It makes short-sighted decisions and doesn't really plan for the future. The other self is more forward-looking and thoughtful. We'll call this system two. And system two engages in long-term planning and is more indicative of my long-term preferences. And so for the purposes of this talk, we're going to consider system two to be indicative of my true preferences or values. And these multiple self models actually show up a lot in the empirical literature. Two studies that we particularly thought were instructive were on looking at the difference between people's consumption patterns in different contexts. So, for instance, when buying groceries, people buy a different distribution of groceries online versus in person. So in person, you tend to buy the things that you want, things like ice cream and the gum at the checkout counter and the candy. But whereas the things that you order online tend to be more vegetables and the household staples that you actually need. Similarly, if you looked at the difference back when you had the option to both order movies online or order DVDs and stream movies online, there's a difference between the things that people chose to watch in the moment. You would stream more action movies and thrillers and that kind of thing, versus the DVDs that you order, which ended up being more documentaries, award-winning films, and so on. So these multiple self models have a lot of grounding in our empirical behavior offline, and what we want to think about is how they manifest online. And to do this, I'm going to give you a formal model in which we like to think about the interaction between these two types of thinking, system one and system two. Now, my model that I'm going to talk about today is going to be a fairly simple one. It's going to be a model of linear consumption. And what I mean by that is, think about an online platform like Twitter or TikTok where there's a single feed, right? You don't really make any choices within that feed. You just decide, am I going to go on to the next piece of content or not? Do I keep scrolling or not? Okay, so you can think of this linear feed that I have available to consume, and my only decision is, should I stay or should I go? Do I stay on this platform and continue to consume, or do I leave and do something else with my time? And the way that our agents in this model are going to behave is they'll have two sets of preferences, given by system one and system two. System one is impulsive and gets to act first. And so the way that we model this is with some probability p, and we're going to say independently across all pieces of content, that piece of content is engaging to system one. Right? And if that content is engaging to system one, then system one mindlessly goes on and scrolls on to the next item without really thinking about whether you want to stay on the platform or not. Okay? So system one automatically scrolls whenever it's engaged. And with the remaining probability, that 1 minus p, system one temporarily loses interest and hands off control to system two. Okay? So the way it's going to work is then system one gets the first choice. If system one is not engaged, system two gets to act. And the way that system two behave is a little bit more complex. System two is going to plan for the future and actually try to maximize its own value or make the choice that maximizes its value. And the way that we model this is system two has some value for each piece of content. We'll say this may be drawn from some distribution, but you know the expectation of that distribution up front. And it's comparing that against its outside option, which has some constant value W. And the only twist to this model now is we need to model diminishing returns in some way, because system two doesn't want to be on this platform forever. There's some finite amount of time that you want to spend on any platform. And so the way that we're going to model that here is a simple independent coin flip at every round. So at every time step, you're going to flip a coin with bias Q. And if that coin comes up heads, system two maintains its interest in the platform and wants to continue consuming. If that coin flip comes up tails, then you lose interest in the platform, and system two no longer derives any value from being there. Okay? So this is how we're going to model diminishing returns. You can think of it as there's a stochastic amount of time that you want to spend on the platform. At some point, you hit your time limit, and you just want to get out of there. Now, if system one did not exist, then it would be obvious what you do. System two just bails off the platform as soon as that coin comes up tails. But the problem is, even when system 2 is ready to leave, system 1 might be in control and might keep you strung along on that platform and keep scrolling until you finally lose interest. Okay, so putting this together then, our model has a few parameters. Okay, we're going to have this parameter p, which I'll refer to as moorishness, or the extent to which you want more of something. That's going to be the probability with which content engages system 1. Content also has span. And what I mean by span is this probability q. It's this sort of parameter that governs the actual amount of time you want to spend on that platform. And then content has value v, or expected value v, and that's what system 2, the value that system 2 gets from consuming a piece of content, and system 2 has some outside option w. And because this model is invariant to scaling, you can think of w as just being 1 if you'd like. Now, without going into the details of exactly how we're going to derive these things, there's two quantities that you might care about in this model. One, which you might expect, is utility. How happy are you with this platform, right? How much utility do you derive from it? And this is going to be net utility, so it's what you get from being on the platform minus what your outside option would have been if you had left and done something else. Okay? And the second quantity that we might care about is engagement. How many items did you consume, or how long did you actually spend on the platform? And so you can run through the math and you get these expressions. One simple way to try to understand what's going on here is this diagram that I put at the top, where you can divide each session that a user spends into time where system 2 is interested in the platform, which is in green here, and time where system 2 is not interested in the platform and is just sort of stuck because system 1 is still engaged. And the thing that you notice, obviously utility and engagement are not the same in this model, but it's actually interesting to note where they differ. And in particular, utility decreases with this parameter of moorishness. So the more something appeals to your system 1, the less happy you are. Whereas the opposite is true for engagement. The more it appeals to your system 1, the more time you end up spending on the platform. This indicator for utility being greater than 0 I've put here just because by assumption we say that if utility would be negative for using the platform, the agent chooses not to use it at all. Now what we're going to assume for this talk, and this is where some of the interesting phenomena come from, we're going to assume that the platform only observes your engagement. And this is sort of consistent with how a lot of platforms work. They look at your behavior, but they never really understand your utility, right? When was the last time you told Twitter, I am this happy with my time today? So for the most part, they're really just observing these engagement signals. And so what we're going to think about is a platform that observes your engagement and tries to optimize for that. We're going to think about what the effects are on your utility. Now, we can just, we have a small number of parameters. We can actually just make some plots and try to understand how these quantities vary. So the first thing you might try is just say, what if I fix all the parameters except for its moorishness, or its appeal to your system 1? What happens as I vary that? Well, as expected, we have this effect where your utility goes down, right? The more appealing it is to system 1, the lower your utility, until it drops to a point where you're not even willing to use the platform anymore. But the opposite is in fact true for engagement, where the more appealing it is to your system 1, the longer it keeps you on the platform. And so you might look at this and say, okay, this is a particularly simple example. Is this actually what platforms look like? And of course, we can think of slightly more complex versions of this example. For instance, let's say, again, I'm going to vary the moorishness of content, but let's say that moorishness is also positively correlated with value. So content that is less boring or more appealing to system 1 is actually also better for system 2, right? Appeals to your value more. Now we get slightly more interesting effects, right? There's a regime here where increasing moorishness makes you stay on the platform longer as expected, but also makes you happier, right? There's some internal maximum for your utility. But this only happens up to a point. And after that point, increasing moorishness continues to make you spend longer on the platform, but doesn't make you any happier, and in fact makes you less happy. So these are examples of what we might call content manifolds, right? These are sort of subspaces of the parameters with which we might think about optimization as doing different things on. And so we conceptually think of this content manifold as just including a bunch of content that exists in this latent space of these parameters, p, q, and v, right? We can now think about the effects of trying to move within this space. What happens as we start to think about optimizing for engagement, and how is that going to affect utility? And importantly, how does that depend on the shape of this space in the first place? And so that's the basic question that's the starting point here. Suppose the platform optimizes engagement, right? Your expected time on the platform. This produces some point in the space with some parameters. But the basic question you might have is, how does this differ from maximizing utility? I would have gotten something else if I had maximized utility. How far apart are these, and to what extent can they be aligned? And so with the rest of my time, I'm just going to briefly go over a couple of results that we have here. Result number one, which may be unsurprising to you, is that maximizing engagement can fail to maximize utility. And of course, these are different functions. You shouldn't expect them to be maximized at the same point. But interestingly, you can pinpoint specific reasons why they're different. Right? What features of the content space lead them to be different and make the sort of content space look like the space of junk food in some sense? Right? What are the wedges that get introduced between engagement and utility? The second set of things you can then ask is sort of the converse of that. Is under what conditions are they the same? Right? Under what conditions is engagement a reasonable proxy for utility? And you might think that this is the type of thing that a platform is trying to look for, right? They are using engagement optimization as a proxy for utility. Is that a good assumption? And can we characterize sort of spaces of content for which it is? Now, the third set of things that we might ask then is what information would it take to distinguish between junk food and salad, right? If I only observe engagement, of course, this isn't going to be enough to tell me whether you're actually happy or not. I need some signals of your utility. So what does it take? Maybe does it take some survey data? Does it take the length of time that you spend in between sessions? How might I incorporate some auxiliary data to better learn this divide between junk food and salad? And the last set of things that I find interesting to think about in the language of this model are design decisions, right? Think design decisions like autoplay, right? The next video on YouTube might automatically play. Or perhaps the opposite of that, where a platform might introduce reminders to take a break every 15 minutes, right? How would those design decisions lead you to both learn about different types of content, right? We might be able to use these design decisions to better distinguish the chips from the salad. And we also might be able to use these design decisions along with a better understanding or a better, more accurate behavioral model to help users realize their true preferences, right? Maybe it's actually better for users to remind them to take a break every once in a while and allow them to get more of their system 2 involved relative to system 1. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thanks so much for your time, and looking forward to your questions. Kara?
Could you come to the microphone, please? Or I can press.
How do you resolve the fact that for a long time we've had the intuition that, for example, for ad auctions, if we maximize welfare, then it's better for revenue in the long run because we're keeping people in the auctions, versus here maximizing engagement is exactly not maximizing utility and welfare.
Right. So there's a separate question which is sort of unresolved by this, or not even considered by this model, which is how often do you come back? What do you do in the long term? If you're consistently getting low utility from the platform in the long term, is that going to make you less likely to use it going forwards? And I think incorporating something like that in the model makes it clearly rational for a platform to be thinking about utility as opposed to thinking about engagement, right? But then the question still remains as to how would they actually maximize utility if they don't really observe signals from it. So I think of this model is talking about one individual session. I think your question is getting to the question of what happens in the long run across multiple sessions, and we're not really considering that in this model, but it's a great question. Thanks, Kara.
Really nice work. You said something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Cool. That makes no difference. Great. I really enjoyed the talk. Maybe I misunderstood something, but at some point you showed a sort of schematic saying, with a piece of content, there's a period of time where system 2 finds the content valuable, and then there's a residual period of time afterwards where system 1 just won't stop. In your model, does system 2 ever stop early, but not exactly at the beginning, kind of anticipating that system 1 will go on for too long to kind of try to strike a balance?
So this is a good question. It sort of depends exactly on how you model diminishing returns. The particular model of diminishing returns here is memoryless. And because it's memoryless, that actually you don't need to look ahead, essentially. Like, if you were willing to continue yesterday, you're willing to consider, or to continue today. if you think about models of diminishing returns that are a little more continuous, you actually do get that look-ahead feature where it's like, I'm nearing the end of the session. I'm sort of almost tired of it, but not quite yet. But I'm going to leave early because I know that if I stay another 1 or 2 pieces of content, I'll end up staying for 10 instead. And so that's sort of...
That would seem to be important if you want to model something like these, like 15 minutes on Facebook kind of timers, right? If System 2 thinks it's good to go on Facebook, but only for 15 minutes, you need to have some kind of mechanism to make that make sense.
Yeah, and so the way that works in the current model is that if you introduce the type of mechanisms, they only really take effect in the period of time where System 1 is engaged, but System 2 doesn't want to be there anymore. But of course, as you start to think of these more complex models of diminishing returns, I don't know if we included them in the appendix or not, but they should be there. But in those slightly more continuous models, you get that look-ahead effect.
Actually, we have an online question from Michael Ostrovsky. Practically speaking, what can, say, TikTok do to measure true utility in addition to engagement?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a few strategies that we outline in the paper. Not all of them actually require measuring true utility, but simply learning that utility is different from engagement. So I'll talk about a couple of them. One of them is to simply run surveys, right? So you can just ask people, how happy are you? In practice, a lot of these platforms do that. But the goal of measuring utility might not just be supplementing people's behavior, but actually learning where people's behavior deviates from their preferences. The other class of things that you can do is, for instance, I believe TikTok has this feature where you can ask it to remind you to take breaks. But you can look at how people behave in response to a break, right? If you, every time you see a break, if you then log off the platform, that would suggest that the break is always hitting you when System 1 is engaged, and your System 2 is sort of always ready to leave and is just being kept on by System 1. So things like that might allow you to learn this wedge, even if you're not explicitly measuring true utility.
Let's take one last question, please.
Hi. So, there are a lot of literature about modeling fatigue. So basically, like in a recommender system, like if you keep recommending the same product, so maybe I'm interested in sport, but you keep you recommend me about the sport card, then I maybe get bored. So like, is this a way to model fatigue, or like what are the relationships?
I think if fatigue is sort of the component of the model that's talking about diminishing returns, right? Eventually, given the same thing over and over again, you start to want it less and less, right? And so so that's the component of the model that I think of it interacting with. I think of System 1 as being slightly different, where System 1 isn't really about fatigue per se. It's just about mindless consumption, which I think is slightly different. There are also versions of the model, which I don't think made it into this paper, which consider sort of multiple genres of content, which you tire of or get fatigued of at different rates. And so you can think about how different mixes of content induce you to behave in different ways. Happy to talk about that more afterwards if that's interesting.